Tensions have risen in recent months between the United States of America and China over the USA's fentanyl opioid death crisis. The USA has claimed that tariffs were imposed on China, Canada and Mexico as countermeasures for the importation of fentanyl and related substances. How did this tragic problem of fentanyl and opioid deaths in America become a foreign policy issue? That's what I want to talk about in today's video. I'm Jeff Rich. This is The Burning Archive, and I'm trying a different kind of video today, a faceless video, where I will just talk into the microphone and not into the camera. And this issue of fentanyl is an interesting one because it's the intersection of international affairs, current world politics, world history, because the story between the United States and China about opioid-related products goes back all the way to the 19th century, and also my personal experience in government. I have been watching the United States opioid crisis for nearly 20 years because I was in the Victorian government, a very, very minor government official, but responsible for alcohol and drug policy, and we watched very closely the dramatic problems in the United States about its opioid death problem. So I think I can bring at least some personal knowledge and insight, maybe a little bit of authority, into this video. So how has this issue flared up recently? Well, Donald Trump imposed tariffs on, or threatened to impose tariffs on China, Canada and Mexico, and claimed that they were countermeasures for the importation of fentanyl and related substances. In response, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that the abuse of fentanyl in the US is something that must be solved by the US itself. Going to the report of his remarks in the China Daily in March 2025, Wang Yi was speaking at a news conference in Beijing about China's approach to engage with the Trump administration in the next 4 years, and Wang said that no country should expect good relations with China while it is suppressing and containing China. Commenting on the US imposing additional tariffs on Chinese goods due to the fentanyl issue, Wang said the abuse of fentanyl in the US is something that must be solved by the US itself. China has provided various kinds of assistance to the US to address the issue, and the US should not return good with evil. The Trump administration has escalated rhetoric attributing the USA's opioid epidemic to actions of the Chinese government. The claim, I guess, is that particularly synthetic fentanyl, not so much, I guess, heroin and naturally produced opioids, is produced by precursor chemicals, by mixing precursor chemicals in clandestine labs in various places in America and around the world, and then imported into the United States. Many of those chemicals are produced in China. China produces most of the world's manufacturing, a large proportion of its, a large proportion of over a third of the world's total manufacturing, a large proportion of its chemicals manufacturing. It's hardly surprising that some precursor chemicals come from China. But the particularly populist political commentators in right-wing political commentators, but also left-wing political commentators in the United States have tended to attribute blame and direct responsibility as it's some kind of, invasion by drugs, a kind of Chinese opium war against America in the 21st century. Figures like Steve Bannon draw parallels between America's opioid epidemic and the opium wars of the 19th century. The implication is that China is out for revenge and intends to inflict a century of humiliation on the USA in the same way as the ruthless British and American merchants who broke Imperial China's domestic controls of the opium problem. The opium wars from the 1840s, largely between Britain or the British Empire and China, and the East India Company's importation against China's rules of opium into China created a social catastrophe in China and ultimately contributed to a war in which the British Empire and US merchants supported the rights of those merchants to sell illegal drugs to poor Chinese citizens for the sake of imperial profits. Indeed, China, the East India Company, had begun growing and processing opium in the province of Bengal from the 17th century, particularly in the 18th century, and it sold it profitably into China. But as the problems of addiction grew in China, the Chinese government saw it as a serious problem. In fact, in the year 1800, it banned both the production and importation of opium. Talk about, Nixon's war on drugs being the start of drug prohibition is very ahistorical. China prohibited opium in 1800. And in 1813, it went a step further by outlawing the smoking of opium and imposing severe punishments on offenders. But the British India Company ruthlessly broke down those controls, smuggled opium from both British and American traders into China through the south coast near Hong Kong. And in 1834, and in response in 1834, the British East India Company actually was deprived of its monopoly over British opium. In roughly 30 years, from 1810 to 1838, the importation of opium to China had increased tenfold. Just imagine that. And to some degree, that is part of the problem of the opium crisis in America today, but it is not all the fault of the British East India Company this time. And Britain ultimately went to war to enforce its right to sell opium and to overturn the, domestic policy reforms to control the problem of drug abuse in China for the sake of British and American merchants. That was in the 19th century. However, American misuse of drug control in diplomacy is not limited to the 19th century and not limited to the Trump administration. Indeed, at the San Francisco summit in late 2023 between Presidents Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, USA officials trumpeted concerns about fentanyl imports, while Chinese officials spoke of the harmonious development of the world. Indeed, American malpractice in drug control diplomacy is long-standing. In the early 20th century, when Chinese officials initiated the first international narcotic control agreement in Shanghai in 1909, the USA played the spoiler. Although in the last years of his presidency, Teddy Roosevelt had played some level of constructive role in bringing together this Shanghai Opium Commission in February 1909, ultimately the American government revealed yet again that America is not always agreement capable in diplomacy, and got in the way of the first international drug control treaty. 3 years later, at The Hague, the International Opium Convention, 1912, was signed, and it was really the beginning of international drug controls and responding to major issues in China. Again, in that year, in 1906, before that convention, China had sought to prohibit the cultivation and smoking of opium in the Chinese Empire for a period of 10 years. There was a high and tragic level of addiction, but many American merchants made a lot of money and they were not so keen on controls. So just as in 2025, the difficult work of international cooperation on drug control was sacrificed for grandstanding on the domestic political stage. Today, despite a common view in Washington that fentanyl is now a foreign policy problem, there's a Council of Foreign Affairs paper on that very issue. The root causes of the USA opioid epidemic are found at home. North American deaths, it's also been a significant problem in Canada, but most severely in the United States of America. North American deaths from opioid misuse have increased in several waves over decades. Since 1999, increased prescribing of natural and semi-synthetic opioids like oxycodone, primarily for pain management, contributed to growing deaths. From 2010, sharp increases in heroin use added an expanding layer of death. Then from 2013, the emergence of synthetic opioids such as fentanyl saw a rapid increase in deaths. Within 4 years, deaths from fentanyl had doubled the number of deaths from OxyContin. Since 2019, fentanyl deaths have increased at a faster pace, and deaths from the old problems of cocaine and methamphetamine have surged. It is deeply tragic. I watched this growing crisis closely for over 10 years when I was responsible for drug policy in a state government. In Australia, we would look at the disaster unfolding in the United States and shake our heads and hope that it did not come to Australia. Many observers feared a similar epidemic was coming, but it never did, and that is because there were uniquely American causes uniquely related to, I guess, the failure of government in America that have contributed to this problem. The opioid epidemic is a deeply North American crisis. Canada has experienced some level of crisis too, given its border with the USA, but its universal healthcare and balanced set of policies for drug control, prevention, treatment and harm reduction have mitigated the crisis, although it is still a crisis. The opioid epidemic has hit the USA especially hard because the USA has the high-income world's most expensive, least effective and worst performing health system. And that's not just my opinion. The Commonwealth Fund's Mirror report, looking at I think 9 or 10 high-income countries, including Australia, found that the United States had the worst health system by a long, long way. Most significantly of all, of course, life expectancy itself has flatlined or fallen over recent decades in the USA. And the opioid epidemic, the deaths of despair, has been a major contributor to this fall in or stagnation in life expectancy, unlike most of the world. The root causes of this 25-year-long catastrophe are the domestic policy failures of the USA, as shown by the Lancet Stanford Commission in 2022. It was chaired by Dr. Keith Humphreys and was formed in response to Stanford Lancet Commission, the famous British-based medical journal, leading medical journal in the world. Probably the Stanford Lancet Commission on the North American opioid crisis was formed in response to soaring opioid-related morbidity and mortality, death and illness that the United States and Canada have experienced over the past 25 years. And it sought to understand the opioid crisis and propose solutions to it domestically while attempting to stop its spread internationally. They came up with 7 key recommendations or key conclusions, and let me just read those for you. The profit motives of actors inside and outside of the healthcare system will repeatedly generate harmful over-provision of addictive pharmaceuticals unless regulatory systems are fundamentally reformed. The story of the Sacklers and the overselling, overprescribing of pain medication, OxyContin and others, and the overall weak regulatory control of pharmaceutical drugs. And fentanyl is not an illegal drug, it is a pharmaceutical drug. That story is now pretty well known through television dramas, movies, and the personal testimony of many victims and many victims' families. The second conclusion was opioids are both a benefit and a risk to health function and well-being. Opioids' dual nature should be taken into account in drug regulation, prescribing, and opioid stewardship. It's not just a simple question of banning it or locking it away. Pain management is a very tricky thing. Living with chronic pain can be very difficult. So one has to work through the subtle and complex problem of how to get the regime of pain management done well, while not letting the drug market go crazy because of government failure. The third conclusion was integrated evidence-based enduring systems for the care of substance use disorders should be built and supported financially on a permanent basis. This is so important. It's a problem that America struggles with. It's a problem that many countries around the world struggle with, but especially given the highly deficient health insurance and universal healthcare systems, or lack of universal healthcare systems in the United States. It is a desperate problem in America, and the evidence of that is clear for anyone who observes the social crisis of the opioid crisis on American streets. Fourthly, policies are available that maximise the benefit and minimise the adverse effects of criminal justice system involvement with people who are addicted to opioids. Again, one of the world records that the United States holds, I don't know if it's the highest rate, but it is an astonishing rate of incarceration. From memory, I think it's around about 500 persons per million. Australia has around 200. Japan has around 40. Fifthly, fostering healthier environments through programs for safe disposal of opioid pills, substance use prevention and childhood enrichment may yield long-term declines in the incidence of addiction. But again, those issues are largely neglected in the USA. Innovation in biomedical research on pain relievers and medications for opioid use disorder treatment, supply control strategy and delivery of substance use disorder treatment is urgently needed in response to the opioid crisis. All those biomedical researchers who came up with these U-Butte drugs might also come up with a solution. They might. And seventh, developed nations should prevent their opioid manufacturers from promoting over-prescribing in other countries. That means you, the United States of America. Developed nations should also provide generic morphine to low-income nations to ensure adequate pain and palliative care. While there is an overabundance of opioid-related pain and addictive drugs in the United States of America, the International Narcotics Board does note that there is a shortage of pain management in many low-income countries around the world as well. Blaming China doesn't help sort out that problem. You need to have genuine and multilateral cooperation with the other nations of the world. Overprescription and overuse of opioid medications were driven by the profit motives of actors inside and outside the United States healthcare system. The Sacklers, McKinsey, the lobbyists for Congress, the congressional figures who talked, at least, to the lobbyists. The actions of consulting firms and major pharmaceutical companies in recklessly promoting these deadly drugs have now been dramatised in popular film and television. However, at the heart of the problem is the failure of the regulatory systems for pharmaceutical drugs, healthcare and drug control in the USA. Commercial advertising of medical drugs is common in the USA. Practitioner controls are loose. Universal healthcare, uniquely in the high-income world, does not exist. Policing is fragmented. Faith trumps evidence in treatment. The power of lobby groups over the US Congress and executive is well known and compromises corrective action. Regulatory agencies are captured by the industries they monitor. Effective business regulation is unable to limit the importation of precursor substances, and it seems most of that importation is done by Americans through American domestic ports, not by nasty people from China, Mexico and the global south. It is America's approach to drugs, healthcare, and pharmaceutical drugs is a recipe for tragic failure. When powerful, effective pain management drugs were introduced in the early 2000s, many countries, including Australia, including myself, because I was there while some of these responses were happening, managing drug policy in one government in Australia. Many countries responded with drug control, regulatory, policing, and healthcare responses. They contained the problem. The exceptional USA, however, let it rip. Now they scapegoat China to excuse their failure. Rather than play the victim, the USA should examine how it can stop its domestic policy failures spilling over into problems in Mexico, Canada, and the rest of the world, and look at how it can look after its own people and mitigate the horrible, tragic opioid-related epidemic in the United States of America. Thanks for listening. Do subscribe to jeffrich.substack.com, and you might like to read my article on Substack about the US's health system and its failures, spending more to die more. Thanks for listening.